The first time I noticed the pattern, it wasn't because someone disappeared. It was because no one asked where they went. The building didn't have a name anyone used. On paper, it was listed as a residential hotel, but no one called it that. It was a 4-story concrete block tucked behind a closed grocery store, close enough to downtown to be ignored by it. The kind of place people arrived at when the last option stopped answering the phone. People stayed because leaving required momentum they didn't have. I worked intake for a housing outreach program. Not emergency shelter, not long-term placements. This was the in-between layer, the place people landed after the crisis, but before anything improved. My job was records. Names, dates, room numbers, check-ins. I didn't decide who deserved help. I decided who stayed visible inside a system that lost people easily. We used that building a lot. Weekly rentals, cash accepted, no questions unless something broke loudly enough to demand one. That was why it stood out when the same address kept appearing in files marked inactive. Inactive didn't mean missing. It meant someone hadn't shown up for 2 scheduled check-ins. No call, no email, no emergency contact responding. After that, the file closed itself. The system preferred clean endings. At first, it felt ordinary. People drifted. People relapsed. People stopped answering phones all the time. But after a few months, I realized the spacing between those closures was too consistent. Not clustered. Not random. Measured. I started keeping a list I didn't upload. Room numbers. Dates. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to notice when a number repeated. 214 came up more than once. So did 308. And 112. The disappearances didn't trigger reports. No police, no hospitals, no deaths logged. The files simply went quiet and stayed that way. When I visited the building for outreach, I didn't announce myself. Most residents didn't like reminders that someone was counting them. The lobby was narrow and dim, the air smelling faintly of disinfectant layered over something older. The manager, Marlene, sat behind a glass window with a sliding tray. She was a woman in her late 50s, thin, sharp-featured, her dyed blonde hair pulled back into a loose knot. She wore the same cardigan every time I saw her. "You're here about placements?" she asked. "Check-ins," I said. She buzzed me through without asking which rooms. The halls were quiet in a way that felt practiced. Doors closed, radios low, televisions audible but never loud enough to identify what was playing. People passed without speaking, eyes level or down. I knocked on 214. No answer. I knocked again. Nothing. The file said the room was occupied. I asked Marlene about it. "People leave," she said. "Without notice?" She didn't look at me. "This isn't a place people make plans." On the 3rd floor, I spoke to a man sitting on the stairs. He was in his 40s, wearing a hooded jacket and work boots, his dark hair untrimmed, his posture alert but withdrawn. "You know who was in 308? I asked. He stared past me. "I don't ask about rooms," he said. "Did you see her?" He shook his head. "I don't look up there." I didn't ask what he meant. That night, I added a column to my list. Reported missing? Every entry read the same. No. Rooms emptied without cleaning delays. New occupants appeared quickly, sometimes overnight. The paperwork never lagged. If anything, it seemed to anticipate movement. One week, I noticed a room marked repainted, while still listed as occupied. Only the ceiling. The walls remained scuffed, the fixtures unchanged. Just the ceiling. Smooth, brighter, finished with care. I asked Marlene about it. Maintenance, she said. When? She hesitated. Before. Before what? She didn't answer. Another resident moved out carrying a single suitcase. A woman in her early 30s, dark blonde hair tied back, wearing a black coat. She didn't look at anyone as she passed through the lobby. She left everything else behind. Her room was repainted the next morning, only the ceiling. I started noticing how people slept. Chairs turned away from beds, lamps angled upward, not to illuminate, but to occupy the space above. Some people slept curled tightly on their sides. Others stayed awake with lights on. I overheard a quiet exchange near the stairwell. "Don't sleep flat," one man said. "I know," the other replied. I checked the ceiling tiles in the empty rooms. They were thicker than the rest, reinforced. In one, I found fresh screws driven into the beams, as if something needed securing. When I asked Marlene who authorized the work, she looked tired. "Do you want to keep working here?" she asked. On my last night assigned to the building, I stayed after midnight. I sat alone in the office, watching the hallway cameras. They weren't there to catch anything. They never were. They were there to confirm absence. At 1:12 a.m., a light flicked on in 214. Nothing came out. At 1:19, the light went off. At 1:20, the feed glitched for less than a second. When it returned, the door to 214 was open. The room was dark. The next morning, another name went inactive. I marked it. I didn't flag it. Neither did anyone else. By midday, the occupancy count was unchanged. That was the first thing that bothered me. A room had gone quiet. Someone had stopped answering. There should have been a gap, even briefly. There wasn't. The numbers held steady. I told myself the paperwork would catch up later. It already had. Room 214 was still listed as occupied. The name attached to it wasn't one I recognized. The move-in time was logged during the night, hours before I'd marked the previous occupant inactive. The entry was complete. No missing fields. No signs of a rush job. I went back to the building that evening. "I'm checking a placement," I said. Marlene slid the tray open. "Which room?" 214. "It's occupied." "By who?" She slid a form through the tray. No printed name, just a room number and a signature that looked more like pressure than ink. "Did you meet them?" I asked. "People don't always come to the desk." I took the stairs. The second-floor hallway felt narrower than I remembered. Sound didn't travel the way it should have. My footsteps stayed close to me. I stopped outside 214. No sound, no light. I knocked once. Nothing. Across the hall, a door opened part way. A man stood just inside the frame. Mid-40s. Calm expression. "You looking for someone?" he asked. "I'm with housing." He nodded. "Then you already know." I glanced up without meaning to. The ceiling above the doorway had been repainted. The edge was precise, careful. I looked back down. The door across from me was closed. I pulled the turnover logs. Dates overlapped. A repaint logged before a vacancy. A vacancy logged without a departure. Small inconsistencies, each easy to ignore. Together, they suggested the building wasn't waiting for confirmation. I stayed late. Shortly after midnight, a door opened on the 3rd floor. A man stepped into the hallway, paused, then went back inside. The camera skipped for less than a second. When it returned, the hallway was empty. The room status changed moments later, occupied to vacant. No user listed, no initials. The next morning, the ceiling in that room was fresh paint. Only the ceiling. I stopped marking files inactive after that. It didn't slow anything down. The records updated anyway. Rooms never sat empty long enough to register as vacant. One afternoon, I found an entry with my initials attached. I hadn't been there that day. The timestamp placed me in the building during an hour I knew I'd spent elsewhere. The update itself was routine, except I hadn't done it. I went back that night and stood outside 214. I didn't knock. I placed my hand against the door. It was warm. Not the warmth of someone standing nearby, something deeper, distributed. Above me, the air shifted. Pressure. The door opened a fraction of an inch. No one stood there. The room was empty, clean, ready. The ceiling was perfect. I stepped back and closed the door. Marlene was at the desk when I returned the key. "You should transfer this account," she said. "Why?" "Because it doesn't need oversight anymore." I stayed in the hallway after midnight once more. The light behind me flickered and steadied. Above me, the ceiling creaked. Not the sound of old materials cooling, a slow adjustment, like weight being redistributed. The pressure in the hallway shifted closer. The door handle turned slightly, not opening, acknowledging. I stepped back. The handle returned to its place. The ceiling creaked once more, satisfied. The next morning, room 214 was listed as occupied. No name, no move-in time, just a status line I hadn't seen before. Account active. No initials, no authorization. I transferred the building that afternoon. The disappearances didn't increase. They didn't spread. They stabilized. Whatever was happening didn't disrupt the system. It preserved it. I don't say this to explain what it is or why it chooses anyone. Only that after a certain point, the building no longer waited for us to keep track of it. It already was. And once that happened, our involvement stopped mattering. Not because people vanished, but because nothing ever needed to pause when they did. If you're still listening, the silence worked. Subscribe to Hushwarden Horrors. The next story is already waiting.